In this lecture, we're going to be looking at what your textbook refers to as the debate over materialism. I'm going to be focusing on the ideas of Marx and Engels in this section. He gives a quick synopsis of what materialism is on page 60 of your textbook. So he writes, materialism is a loose term, to be sure. In philosophy, materialism is the idea of the primacy of matter over mind, as opposed to idealism, which says that ideas rule the world, or religions like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, which tell us that we have an immortal, non-physical soul and that the physical world was created and maintained by an immaterial divine being. Okay, so that's a kind of very broad definition, but the most influential form of this, certainly for our time period, comes out of Marxism. So that is what I'm going to be focusing on. And I'm contrasting this with, for instance, Weber, who was very aware of Marxist thought, as was Durkheim, and influenced by it, but rejected certain elements of it, including this basis in materialism. So Weber could largely, I don't want to put it too simply, but could be called an idealist. He was very concerned with how ideas shape society, whereas Marxists look strictly at the kind of material basis of society. And I'll talk about that more as we go along. So when we're talking about materialism, we have to start with Karl Marx, who I'm sure all of you have heard of. And there's a good short bio of him in your textbook on page 60. He was the primary architect of what we would now call communism, and his personal preoccupations and interests very much color his philosophy. And so we talked at the very beginning of the course about the idea of conflict theory, and so Marxist thought is very much coming out of is one of the primary examples of conflict theory. And many of the thinkers we're going to be looking at later in the course are, while not maybe explicitly Marxist, are either answering to Marxist ideas or influenced by Marxist ideals. So we can see with Marx that, like many of the thinkers we've been looking at so far, he can't be boxed into just sociology. And really, sociology, as we know it, doesn't exist in his early career, but he's definitely claimed as one of the pillars of contemporary sociology. He was born in 1818 in the Rhineland region of Germany, which was under Prussian rule, and had been very influenced by French thought as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. And so we can see within Marx, he's engaging with French revolutionary thought, and the French Enlightenment ideas are very much mixing together with German philosophy. And so we know that his father converted from Judaism to Christianity for what Mann calls practical reasons. This was a fairly common thing that happened at the time. I've talked about this already in terms of Durkheim, where upper middle class Jewish families, in order to fully gain rights of citizenship, often felt that they needed to convert, at least in outwardly, to Christianity. It's not clear how much impact this had on Marx himself. He was, or maybe it did, because he rejected religion outright. So he attended the University of Bonn and then later Berlin. And he joined a group called the Young Hegelians, a group of radical thinkers. And so we see from his very earliest time period, he's a radical thinker, and eventually he's exiled from Germany. It's pretty clear that he meets up with Friedrich Engels, and I'll be talking about Engels separately, that they thought that their revolution was going to come about in a country like Germany. Or England. So we're going to see that isn't actually how it played out, but that was the initial idea. And so he is exiled to London, where he writes the most famous work of Marxist theory, Das Kapital. There's a very famous story about him being in the British Library and working in the British Library. And so he is, along with Engels, is the foundational thinker of historical materialism. They develop it together. Now, Friedrich Engels often gets left out in my experience, and it's interesting to speculate on why that might be, and I can do that when we speak about Engels. Friedrich Engels, as I said, was the other key thinker and writer within the development of historical materialism. He was also born in Prussia into a Protestant family, into what a Marxist would call a bourgeois family. His father owned a factory, and he himself worked within the family business off and often bankrolled Karl Marx with the money. So this is not uncommon, and again, it's food for thought. I've often thought about it, that so many of these revolutionaries were themselves coming from the bourgeois class. And it explains, for me, why they often misrepresent the proletariat, because they never knew anyone from the proletariat. That's my opinion. So we're told that he came from a very traditional family, so he was quite rebellious, and that he was devoted to his mother. And this, I believe, because we're going to see he, unlike almost any other Marxist thinker, actually speaks about the role of women and gender. And so it makes sense to me that he had a close relationship with his mother. So he himself also goes to England, and he's working in the family business in England, and alongside Karl Marx while he's there. So he co-writes the Communist Manifesto and edits Das Kapital. So, as I said, he was born into a bourgeois Protestant family. He moved to England and worked as a businessman. And he was also, if we can say it that way, converted to atheism. So we can see that both Karl Marx and Engels became militant atheists, and this becomes a really central part of the communist idea, that religion is something that holds people back from the revolution. Many of you will be familiar with the idea that Marxists will say that religion, or Marx himself said that religion is the opium of the people, and so it's the idea that this fantasy of the divine stops them from rising up against their oppressors. And so this becomes one of the most potent anti-religious ideas, maybe the most potent, and it has extreme consequences all around the world wherever communist powers come into being. The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, is the manifesto that all later manifestos strive to imitate and dream of having as much influence. And so, for good or ill, depending on how you look at it, this is one of the most influential documents ever written. And so I'm going to be offering it as an assignment that you can analyze the Communist Manifesto, and then you can apply it to our society and see if you agree with what it's saying. I find with many of these Marxist material, very few people have actually read it. They sort of vaguely know what it's about. So I did want to include at least a short section just to give you a sense of the sort of tone of it. So this would have been passed from hand to hand all over the world. So the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition. So here very clearly is the view of Karl Marx and Engels that all of history has been, at its base, a power struggle and a class struggle. Okay, so if you're a doctrinaire Marxist, you accept this as axiomatic. This is just a fact. Now, obviously, it's not. It's an idea. But if you're a Marxist, this is what you believe. So that all through history, this is what it's been. It's been a class struggle, and that it's, so you can see why this would be the basis of most conflict theory, that the idea of opposition and having to fight against this in this class struggle. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. Okay, so Marx puts forward this completely convincing argument. I agree with him here that bourgeois society emerges as kind of the victor over feudal society. I talked about this in the very first lectures, that by the 1800s, feudal society is crumbling in many parts of Europe, and so the bourgeois classes the mercantile classes are emerging as the most powerful during the Industrial Revolution. And so he argues that despite the fact that they are becoming more and more powerful, that doesn't mean that there isn't class antagonism. And he actually argues that it becomes worse under this capitalist system. So society as a whole is more and more splitting into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Okay? So in his mind, this change has actually simplified things. This conflict has been going on forever, but now it's clear. There's just two great classes. Now, again, this is his argument. And if you want to do this as a topic, you can argue for or against. If any of you have known any Marxist-inclined philosophers or activists, just so you know, calling someone bourgeois is the insult. That word is used as an insult. So the bourgeoisie are the upper middle class. And again, what that means is never fully sketched out. And I've discussed this with a number of Marxists. When you talk about the class system, what exactly do you mean? It's unclear. And certainly when we try to compare Canada to, say, German or English society at this time, it doesn't map completely on. But nonetheless, the basic outlines are there. So the idea of people who own the means of production, these great industrialists, and then their workers who work for wages. The Communist Manifesto, partly because it's so succinct, unlike Das Kapital, it's very, you can see why it was such a popular document. It reads very well, it's very clear, it's well written, it's stirring. So he goes on to say, not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and the bourgeois state, so he's talking about the proletariat, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine. And so this should sound familiar. We can see here that where Weber was influenced by Marx. He didn't end up agreeing with Marx, but he definitely agreed with this idea that the Industrial Revolution has in many ways made life even worse for the lower classes. And so they're enslaved by the machine, by the bourgeois state, and by the bourgeois class. So this is a very complex theory. I'm only touching on it here. If you're interested, there's lots of reading you can do, but certainly this is the basic outline of his idea, his Engels and Marx ideas. So, and by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. So the proletariat, the wage laborers, go to work in these huge factories, and I already touched on this in the earlier lecture. These, I'm sure you all know, very inhumane conditions, often working, unlimited hours per day. Trade unions didn't exist yet. There was no limitations. There were children working within these factories. And so there's no doubt it was a form of extreme exploitation. He's correct here. So no sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer that he receives wages in cash than he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc. And here is our Marx and Engels at their best, because I think this one, you could map it quite nicely onto Canada. Just if any of you live in North Bay, just take a drive out to Ferris or other parts of town and see the pawn shops and the payday loan places. And I'm going to be attaching an article on payday loans, which is amazing to me that they are legal with the rates of interest that they charge and take advantage of people who are struggling. And so I actually heard a stand-up from Jim Gaffigan, and he was basically saying, why is it that when you have lots of money, the bank gives you money, but when you have no money, they take your money away and charge you, which is absolutely true. So he's basically saying the proletariat, the working class, are just being completely oppressed and victimized by the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie are benefiting from this oppression. So as I said previously, while working in London, Marx writes his kind of magnum opus, which is Kapital or Das Kapital, which remains the kind of ur-text of historical materialism and Marxism. And now, of course, there are many interpretations of this work. This one gets much more abstruse. So he goes into a lot of really detailed discussion of economics. And so there's arguments ongoing within Marxist thought of what he actually meant and what he meant to come from this. But a very important aspect of Marxism is that the idea of praxis, that this isn't just something that we're debating over whiskey. This is going to be radical and revolutionary. It's going to change society. It's going to lead to revolution. So he uses this very dramatic language of, the proletariat has to throw off its chains and take over society. So it may not seem like it when we look at what it actually looks like in practice, but certainly in its beginnings, as is often the case, this is a very utopian view of society, actually trying to create a perfectly equal egalitarian society. But as we're going to see, that doesn't happen, and that never happens. But certainly his wish was that these writings would result in revolution. So, and that's precisely why he was exiled from Germany. So, as I said, Capital, there's a lot. It can be very difficult to follow, but I wanted to just look at this section. So we see him continuing with the theme of exploitation. So certainly on a certain level, Marx is a humanist. He's very concerned with the well-being of humanity. So he says, since the exploitation of one class by another is the basis of civilization. So he's retaining that idea from the Communist Manifesto that this exploitation has been there from the beginning. And of course, we can problematize this by saying there are cultures that, like the indigenous cultures of the New World, that this isn't necessarily, you can't really use this argument. But anyway, there is no doubt that Marx is very much coming out of a European tradition. So its whole development moves in continuous contradiction. Every advance in production is at the same time a retrogression in the condition of the oppressed class, that is, of the great majority. So he's basically saying that this conflict just keeps continuing, but in fact it becomes worse for the oppressed classes. So I gave the example of factories. And I just wanted to also say that in the feudal system, and I think I did mention this, no matter how bad things got, if you had a small amount of land, you could grow food, you could have a cow, you could have milk, and so on, or you could share with your neighbors. So in some ways, in that early industrial revolution, these working people have it worse than the people in the feudal system, and he's right, because they had no land, and so they couldn't sell it, and they couldn't grow food, and so they couldn't maintain themselves in a kind of subsistence pattern, which would have been very common across the world, and still is in the world, where people just grow enough to maintain themselves and their families. So this was not possible for the working class in the early industrial revolution, and so he's saying, in fact, the situation has become even worse. And he looks at this as stages of development, and that this then leads to the revolution. What is a boon for one is necessarily a bane for the other. Each new emancipation of one class always means a new oppression for another. So you can see his view is very much based on these kind of power dynamics within society and what we would now call conflict theory. So the idea that the bourgeois may have triumphed over the aristocratic classes, for instance, but then they go on to oppress the working classes. I did want to include some of Engels' own writing here, and as I alluded to earlier, he was much more concerned with gender issues. This has been an ongoing critique of Marxism, that they kind of reject gender, and this was an issue for Bernie Sanders, actually, when he was running to be the Democratic candidate for president, that both race and gender, often within the Marxist way of looking at the world, are called what they call epiphenomenal. They're just the result, they believe, the result of the economics. And so Marxists have, I'm painting with a very broad stroke here, but would put that at the center rather than, for instance, race or gender. And this has come into the present time when there are debates about Marxist theory. Now, with Engels, we find actually he talks directly about it, and I would suggests that maybe this is why he's forgotten a lot of the time, because he actually took it very seriously. And so a lot of socialist feminists actually look back to Engels more than they look back to Marx. Engels, very interestingly, was looking at material emerging from, many of you will probably already know, that missionaries in places like Canada and the United States were making careful records of the cultures that they came in contact with. Now, obviously, they were trying to convert them, but nonetheless, the records were often accurate and were coming back to Europe. And so Engels was reading some of these that were talking about in what we would now call indigenous cultures in places like Canada and the US. And so he believed, and this goes on to seed a certain type of feminism, along with other thinkers, that these societies were communistic or communist in the way they ran things, and that you could argue that they're collectivist. I think that's accurate. So he writes, but the communistic household implies the supremacy of women in the house, just as the exclusive recognition of a natural mother, because of the impossibility of determining the natural father with certainty, signifies the high esteem for women, that is, for the mothers. So this does influence certain streams of feminism. So the idea that again, we're getting into contested territory because, as I said with the hunter-gatherers, we don't know what was going on in the distant past. So this idea that perhaps in the earliest forms of human culture, the mother was at the center because there was, we didn't have the creation of the patriarchal family. So the argument goes that the patriarchal family starts to assert monogamy and the idea that doing that in order to assure that the children, particularly the sons, are of the father, and so on. So Engels is going with this, and so the idea that in these cultures and in earlier cultures, even within Europe, the mother was actually at the center. Again, this is contested and is often being used ideologically. But he goes on to say, in Seneca Iroquois society, usually the female portion ruled the house, the stores were in common, the women were the great power among the clans. This is actually accurate from what I have gleaned of the Six Nations. And so I find it interesting that Engels is engaging with this as kind of the high watermark of communism and what he would see in this kind of utopian society where women are equal to men, just as they were in indigenous cultures in North America. I want to turn now to looking at the impact of the ideas of Marx and Engels and the Russian Revolution. It's very strange to think. Most of you are probably far too young to remember the USSR, but I was a teenager when it ended, or maybe in my early 20s. So I remember it very well. And so these ideas go on to seed various revolutions around the world, which is exactly what they wanted to do. And those revolutions had enormous impact on world history. And so despite the fact that supposedly we came to the end of history, there's been a lot of history. And so some of you may have heard that Putin longs for this Russian empire. So in many ways, the Russian Revolution leads to the USSR, which is a form of Russian imperialism, really. And so I'll talk about that in more detail as we move along. But what this creates, in some ways, is what Churchill called the Iron Curtain. And so there's this tremendous division between communist-influenced societies and the rest of the world, particularly the democratic countries. So at this time, going forward after the 1940s, we see what's called the Cold War. And this has a huge impact on the world, and the world is sort of carved up into these spheres of American and Russian influence. Now we're in another very challenging cultural moment. Things have changed completely now. So we need to have a sort of a look at the history here. So leading to the creation of the Soviet Union, we have to look first at the October Revolution in Russia itself in 1917. And some of you will have learned this, or most of you will have learned about this in history. I'm not going to go, obviously, into a huge amount of detail. But that time, you can see the timing there, that's just at the end of the First World War. And as was the case in France and England and Germany, this was a catastrophic war, and millions died. It was a war that had never been seen before because of the use of modern technology and trench warfare. And so we see the way that Russia had already been in a state of instability, but this war pushes it over the edge, and the returning soldiers are completely disillusioned. And so we see the October Revolution, and civil war breaks out. So there's a civil war between the white armies and the red armies, so the red armies being the communists, and eventually the monarchy was abolished and the royal family was executed. And so many of you will know this story. There's all sorts of really things you couldn't make up, like Rasputin and so on, that probably led to some of this. But the violence of the revolution is a very defining part of it. And this is where I part ways with this thought. While I see the brilliance of the analysis of society, the Marxist, the saying always was, you have to break eggs to create an omelet. And that generally means, in my view of it, a lot of bloodshed. So, and this is in fact the case. And so the Bolsheviks come into power, and Vladimir Lenin takes over as the head of this new Russian state, and then eventually the Soviet Union. So Russia had been living in largely in a feudal system still, of what's called serfdom. And that is why most Marxists were very surprised that the revolution happened in Russia, because it hadn't gone through that process of industrialization, which they believed was the necessary step to the revolution. And this was also true in the case of China. So clearly there was something off in their theory. But it seemed like these feudal systems were actually more open to this kind of revolution, which makes sense to me. And so serfdom was abolished, and the USSR was created in 1922, so taking into its sphere what's now Ukraine, Belarus, and then increasingly after World War II, Poland, Latvia, all these countries around. So the Soviet Union introduced radical social, economic, and political change. And so we really see with the Soviet Union, again, that idea, very Comtean, that you can kind of engineer society. This is a very much a communist idea, that you can create this rational, efficient society. In this case, completely non-democratic, and you can sort of create this egalitarian, perfect society. However, as we see immediately, this leads to what's called the Holodomor in Ukraine. And some of you may have heard of this during the current Ukrainian-Russian war. I saw pictures of people protesting in Toronto, and they were part of the Ukrainian diaspora, and they were holding up signs saying, this isn't 1932, we remember the famine. So the Holodomor was a famine that resulted in Ukraine because the Communist Party decided it was going to completely restructure agriculture. And so these wealthy kind of peasants who had farms were often executed or removed from their land, which then created a huge emigration to places like Canada. For instance, some Mennonites came during that period because they were removed from their large estates. And so it also resulted in the death of millions of people from starvation. So again, we start to see very early on that this utopian idea that you can engineer a state like this often leads to disaster. I'm going to conclude this lecture with the Chinese Revolution, which occurs beginning in 1911, 1912. It's the result of a long process, a lot to do with pressure from Western powers, particularly Britain, on China to open up to the West, to open up its markets. And just to be clear, China was never conquered. Hong Kong was taken by the British, parts of Shanghai, but China itself was never conquered. But nonetheless, it was destabilized. And so we see in 1911, 1912, the Manchu dynasty that had been ruling since the 17th century is overthrown. Some of you may know of the movie The Last Emperor that looks at that final emperor of China. And then there's a long period of civil war in China as it struggles, like many countries. If you depose your monarchy, then what's the system going to be? And so in 1949, Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong declared the creation of the People's Republic of China after the Civil War. And so this remains in place. China is still Marxist. It's changed a lot. It's opened up a lot since the 1970s. It's opened up its markets, but nonetheless, its system is still communist. The Cultural Revolution was launched by Mao Zedong in 1968 and is referred to as the Great Chaos. And this is another point where I part paths with the Marxists, because everywhere there is a communist revolution, there is this great chaos. And it's partly comes back to Marxist thought, which is that tradition and custom, those stabilizing forces, are seen by Marxists as blocking the revolution. And so you have to break down all these pre-existing cultural forces. But that, of course, leads to an incredible amount of cultural instability as a result. And so just to give an example that I've raised already, that attack on religion. And so both in the Soviet Union and in China, we see this direct attack on religion. Various forms of clergy, Buddhist monks and nuns are murdered or defrocked. When we look at the Cultural Revolution, in which this is a very strange phenomenon. Historians still struggle to make sense of it. But Mao Zedong created this it's called the Red Guard, these kind of young people who were really zealous, who often would physically attack people in the street for being bourgeois. And so they often attacked intellectuals. I actually know people whose families underwent this, and they would be sent for what was referred to as re-education. And so somebody might be an academic and they'd be sent to work on a farm, for instance, or work as a plumber or something like that. And so this unleashed a huge amount of chaos within Chinese culture. And historians have estimated between 500,000 and 2 million people lost their lives as a result. So, and this, as I've said, whenever I have these discussions with Marxists, they always look at me blankly, but or they'll say that's a misinterpretation of Marx. But everywhere there's been a Marxist revolution, we have seen this kind of violence. So if we look at Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, if anything, they're even more murderous. And they murdered Buddhist monks, they murdered intellectuals, and caused a huge amount of chaos. So by our time period, obviously the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Although, as I said, we think Putin's looking like he's nostalgic for the Soviet Union, and the Chinese government maintains communism, at least in some form. But by and large, certainly in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge doesn't exist anymore. So we live in a landscape where it's often been said that sort of the triumph against communism. I don't think that's completely accurate. And I think it's very important to note that there are other forms of, for instance, democratic socialism that have been extremely successful, that in countries like Denmark, Sweden, and I would argue to some extent in Canada, where these ideas were taken, but the violent revolution part was rejected. And so I think it's very simplistic. In your textbook, he talks about the decline of the left. I don't think that's accurate, but certainly we did see the decline of the Soviet Union. But this influenced sociology greatly, certainly in the United States, where the Cold War really influenced social theory. And so I think I touched on this already, the idea of the Red Scare. This did happen in Canada, but to a lesser extent. In the United States, we see people into the 70s losing their jobs if they espoused any kind of communist thought.